For a long time, the West slept. Its cities dimmed, its roads broke, its memories thinned, like breath fading into winter air. People whispered that Rome was gone forever, lost, dead, a fallen giant buried beneath the weight of 300 quiet years. But they were wrong, because sometimes an empire does not die. Sometimes it sinks. It drifts beneath the surface, like a sunken star, waiting for a hand, brave enough to lift it back into the sky. And on one winter morning, in a basilica filled with candlelight and trembling expectation, that star began to rise. Before we go there, to listen, just listen, to the silence before everything changed. A silence so deep, it feels alive. A silence that holds its breath. The moment before a crown touches a man's hair and changes history forever. This is where the story begins. Not in glory, not in triumph, but in a world that feels abandoned. The West had fractured. Kingdoms broke into smaller kingdoms. Lords ruled over ruins. Priests guarded what little knowledge remained. And Rome, the Rome that once thundered, with legions and laws and marble pride, survived only as a ghost, a memory people carried, like a half-forgotten dream. But even in ruins, dreams do not fade. They wait. And the one who would wake the dream was a man born far from marble halls, a man of iron, a man of storms, a man whose footsteps shook the earth, long before he ever touched a throne. His name would echo through 1,000 years. Charlemagne. He did not rise like a saint. He rose like a fire, a blaze that devoured borders and doubts and the quiet despair that had settled over Europe. Everywhere he rode, kingdoms shifted. Everywhere he stood, new foundations formed. His hands were not gentle. His world was not peaceful. But he carried something no one else had carried. Since Rome collapsed, a vision, a sense that the West could be whole again, that the broken roads could be mended, that faith and law could walk side by side, that people, scattered like sparks, could burn together again beneath one flame, not the flame of conquest, the flame of order, of meaning, of a world rebuilt. And little by little, the vision spread. The Franks united, the Lombards bowed, the Saxons resisted, but even they were pulled into the tide of a man who refused to let the West remain in darkness. But even that was not enough, because to rebuild an empire, you need more than armies. You need a symbol, a crown that carries the weight of centuries, a crown that whispers of Caesar and Constantine and the long golden dream of unity. And so, on a cold morning, in the year 800, inside St. Peter's Basilica, as incense curled, like ghosts of the old world, Charlemagne knelt, not as a conqueror, not as a king, but as a man standing at the edge of something vast. The basilica was silent. The candles flickered like tremors of fate, and Pope Leo III stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, as though each movement could fracture time. And then, in a moment that would echo across continents and centuries, the Pope placed a golden crown on Charlemagne's head. The old world met the new. Rome rose again, and the West took its first breath in 300 years. Imagine that moment. A man crowned emperor of lands he had not yet seen. A man inheriting a dream older than any kingdom standing at that time. A man surprised, perhaps unwilling, yet unable to step away from the weight of destiny now resting on his brow. Some say he was shocked. Some say he resisted. Some say he would never have entered the church had he known what waited there. But destiny does not ask permission, and in that single act, a door opened, a door that had been locked since the fall of Rome, a door through which the medieval world began to walk into a new age. People felt it, a hum beneath the earth, a tension in the air, as though the world itself were stitching its pieces back together, not perfectly, not peacefully, but unmistakably. And from that coronation, something remarkable began. The Carolingian Empire emerged like dawn, breaking through a long night of storms, not bright, not gentle, but undeniable, a realm stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the Alps to the North Sea, a realm pulsing with ambition, faith, and the stubborn hope that unity could still exist. Charlemagne did not rule from a marble throne. He ruled from horseback, from roads, from camps, from restless movement. His empire was not built on walls, but on loyalty, on presence, on the belief that a ruler must walk his lands with his own feet. And so he did, from town to town, valley to valley, church to church. He crossed his empire, like a shepherd, counting every flock. But deeper than that, beneath every law he issued, beneath every battle he won, beneath every treaty he forged, there was one truth. He was trying to rebuild a world that believed it could not be rebuilt, a world that had accepted chaos as its destiny, a world that needed someone to remind it that civilization could rise again from ruin. And slowly it did. Schools reopened, books returned, scriptoria glowed with lamplight as monks copied words that might have died forever. Laws grew clearer, faith grew stronger, cities whispered with life again. Not Roman life, not ancient life, but something new, something Western, something that would become the spine of medieval Europe, an empire, reborn in candlelight and iron. But all of this, all the battles, all the reforms, all the revival, began in a single moment. A crown lowered, a breath held, a world awakened. And that moment, that coronation, that spark, in the winter night of 800, would shape everything that followed. You are standing now at the threshold of that story, a story of empires reborn, identities reshaped, and a West that refused to stay asleep. If you want to walk deeper into this world, if you want to follow the rise and fall of kings and dynasties, if you want to hear the full tale of how Europe remade itself from ash and ambition, then please consider subscribing to the channel so we have the strength to continue telling these stories, stories that deserve to be heard all the way to their final breath. And if you choose to stay awake with this story just a little longer, then come closer, because there is more to that winter morning than candlelight and a crown. History remembers the coronation, but it forgets the trembling, the uncertainty, the quiet shiver that ran through Christendom as news spread, from voice to voice, from monastery to marketplace, from fortress to farm. People asked one another, in hushed tones, what does it mean? Is Rome truly reborn? Is the world changing again? They had lived in a long night of confusion. Generations had grown up, never knowing unity, never knowing stability, never knowing what it felt like to belong to something greater than the fragile borders of local kings. Some feared the future, some prayed for it, but all of them sensed that a threshold had been crossed. And standing at that threshold was Charlemagne, a man others called the Father of Europe, though he had never sought such a title, a man both revered and feared, a man whose presence could silence a hall and steady the pulse of a battlefield. Yet even he could not have foreseen what that crown would awaken, because crowns do not merely rest on heads, they rest on worlds. They press down with the weight of centuries. They whisper in the language of destiny. And this crown, this revived echo of Rome, whispered louder than any crown in living memory. It whispered of responsibility, of burden, of unity, That must be forged, not in marble, but in blood and patience and roads that cut across continents like veins of purpose. And so, after the incense settled and the candles dimmed and the solemn hymn faded into the vast silence of Street Peter's, Charlemagne rose, not taller, not brighter, but heavier, as if the world itself had stepped into his hands. Outside, Rome's winter wind brushed against the basilica doors, carrying with it a sense of motion, as though time, which had drifted for centuries, had suddenly begun to walk again. Word of the coronation spread across the Alps, across the Rhine, across the forests, where villages huddled in the cold dark. Some wept, some celebrated, some merely listened to the distant echo of a world rearranging itself, because the return of an empire is never quiet. It trembles beneath the soil, it hums behind the mountains, it flickers in the fires, lit by travellers who speak of Rome as though it were no longer a ghost, and in monasteries where parchment was precious as gold, scribes dipped their quills into ink with trembling hands, writing the words they knew would reshape history. Carolus Imperator, Charles the Emperor, not king, not warlord, not chieftain of wandering tribes. Emperor, a word that had slept for generations, like a lion beneath a fallen tree, now awake, now stretching, now hungry, and Charlemagne, whether he wished it or not, was the one who had embraced it. But destiny rarely chooses gentle men. It chooses those who move, who reshape, who rebuild the broken bridges between past and present. Charlemagne's world was not one of marble temples or golden eagles. It was a world of cold marches, muddy roads, wooden churches, villagers hidden in forests, and warriors whose loyalty had to be earned again and again. With every passing season, to lead such a world required more than force. It required vision so steady that even chaos would bend around it. And this is what set him apart. He saw the West, not as it was, but as it could become, a land where learning would return, where faith could stabilize, where laws could be shaped into something coherent, predictable, durable, where the memory of Rome could be reborn, not as imitation, but as evolution, and slowly, bit by bit, village by village, chapter by chapter, Europe began to wake. Schools, silent for generations, began to open again. Children learned to read. Monks copied ancient texts by lamplight, rescuing words that might have vanished forever. Clergy were trained. Laws were clarified. Roads were repaired. Markets grew in size and safety. Trade flowed again. Like thawing rivers, a new rhythm began to settle over the Carolingian world, not the thunderous rhythm of Roman legions, not the chaotic rhythm of the dark centuries after Rome, but a rhythm quiet and persistent, a heartbeat returning to a wounded body. Europe was breathing again, and all of it, all the revival, all the reawakening, all the fragile light, returning to a long dark land, traced back to that crown, lowered in Street Peter's. That single, silent, fateful moment, the moment Rome rose again. But remember this, no empire is reborn peacefully. The story ahead is filled with storms, with revolts, with betrayals, with battles fought in snow and swamp and shadow, with the weight of a resurrected legacy pressing down on a world still finding its shape. And yet, beneath all of that, one truth remains: a civilization that believed itself dead was living again. And you, right now, are standing at the doorway of that resurrection, where kings rise, like mountains, where empires crack and reform, where the West begins to remember it once had a spine strong enough to shape centuries. So breathe, settle in, let the story unfold around you, like mist rising from an ancient river, and when you are ready to walk further into this reborn world, to trace the footsteps of emperors whose shadows still touch our lives today, stay close, because the tale is only beginning. For a long time after Charlemagne's crown was lifted, the empire he restored did not shine like a single star. It flickered, it fractured, it bent beneath the weight of jealous princes, ambitious dukes, and popes who guarded their spiritual throne as fiercely as any emperor guarded his earthly one. The West had awakened, yes, but it was not yet steady. Empires do not rise in a straight line. They rise in echoes, each echo shaped by men who inherit glory. They did not create, and burdens they cannot escape. And centuries after Charlemagne, in an age thick with suspicion and sharpened ambitions, two men stepped forward to claim the same crown. Louis of Bavaria, Frederick of Austria. Two kings, one empire, and a world not large enough for both. Their rivalry did not begin with swords. It began with whispers, with alliances shaped in candlelit chambers, with princes who saw opportunity in a divided throne, with churchmen who watched from the shadows, measuring which claimant would bend the knee more readily. The electors split, voices rose, and when the dust settled, the unthinkable happened. The Holy Roman Empire had two emperors, not in legend, not in myth. In truth, Louis, stern, calculating, a man carved out of German forests, held the loyalty of cities hungry for independence and nobles tired of Habsburg pride. Frederick, the Austrian duke, raised among mountains that taught him patience and endurance, held the devotion of his own house and the old belief that the empire was theirs by right. Neither man would yield. The empire groaned beneath their struggle. Allies changed sides, like leaves blown by unpredictable winds. Territories drifted from one banner to another, and the people, merchants, monks, peasants, watched their world split along fault lines they could not see, but deeply felt. And above them, far above them, beyond the palaces and the armoured camps, the Pope watched. For Rome had always believed that crowns must bow to keys, so the papal voice fell like a shadow across the empire. Neither Louis nor Frederick was recognized. Neither crown was considered legitimate. Neither throne was acknowledged. In the eyes of God, the Pope declared it so, and his words did not simply echo. They scorched. Excommunication, condemnation. The weight of heaven turned into a weapon. Louis, defined by defiance, grew harder. His advisers, men of sharp minds and dangerous brilliance, spoke of sovereignty, not granted by the Church, but born from the will of the people. It was a new idea, a radical idea, a seed of something that would grow, century later, into revolutions. But at that moment, it was fire. Frederick, held captive after battle, waited in stone halls, where footsteps echoed, like verdicts. His imprisonment did not break him, it tempered him, and when he walked free again, he returned, not as a defeated man, but as a standard raised. The Alps burned with conflict. Villages vanished into the smoke of shifting frontiers. Armies marched through valleys, once known only for quiet cattle bells and morning dew. And the empire, the fragile empire, reborn beneath Charlemagne's crown, trembled again, not from invasion, not from collapse, but from the simple, devastating truth that authority, divided, becomes authority devoured. Louis pushed south into Italy, into the ancient dream of emperors before him. He marched with confidence and a vision for a world where papal judgment held no chains. City after city opened its gates, dust rose beneath hooves, banners snapped in the wind, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed as though the empire would stand whole again. But Italy is a land shaped by ambition older than memory, a land where loyalties shift, like shadows on stone, a land that sings to those who conquer and swallows those who believe they have conquered enough. The deeper Louis marched, the more fragile his victories became. The more resistance rose from unexpected places, the more he felt that ancient truth: power extended too far, too quickly, begins to crack from within. And as he crowned an antipope in Rome, as he challenged not only Frederick, but the heavens themselves, the empire shivered. People wondered if this was rebirth or ruin, if this was destiny or hubris, if the empire was rising or unraveling. And somewhere, far from the roaring crowds, in small towns where history moves, like a slow river, old men whispered, 2 emperors mean one thing: storms. They were right, because the Holy Roman Empire was never built to hold 2 suns in the same sky. And the age of Louis and Frederick was the age when the sky began to tear, a tear that would widen into wars, into leagues, into shifting loyalties that shaped the centuries to come. But even in the tearing, even in the fracture, one thing remained. The empire lived, bruised, divided, contested, yet alive, because ideas, true ideas, outlive kings, and the idea of empire still pulsed beneath everything, in stone walls, in monks' prayers, in old Roman roads, still stretching across fields like scars that refused to fade, and in the hearts of people who wanted something bigger than the chaos they were born into. This was the empire. Louis and Frederick fought to command an empire too vast to rule easily, too sacred to abandon, too haunted to forget. The empire that would continue to shape the world long after both men were gone. Yet even storms have beginnings that few notice. Before armies marched, before banners tore the sky, before Rome once again became a battleground, between crown and cross there was a quieter fracture, a hairline crack beneath the surface of the empire. It began when trust faded. Princes who once rode under the same banner now looked toward one another with narrowed eyes. Councillors whispered behind carved wooden doors. Letters were sealed and carried through night by riders who said little and knew even less. This was how empires weakened, not with a shout, but with a soft, persistent unravelling. Louis felt it first. He sensed that even victory left shadows. He saw how the electors held their loyalty. Like a coin, they could flip whenever the wind changed. He knew that Frederick's release from captivity had not ended anything. It had merely shifted the balance of fate. Frederick returned to Austria like a ghost, walking back into his own legend. The mountains welcomed him, his people embraced him, but the world was not the same world he had left behind. Louis sat the throne, in name. Frederick sat it, in claim. But the Pope sat it, in judgment, and that judgment carried weight. No sword could cut through. Leo's successor spoke with a firmness that even emperors hesitated to defy. The papal court declared Louis unworthy, declared Frederick unrecognized, declared the throne vacant in the eyes of heaven. The empire hung suspended between earth and sky, unable to breathe. Louis understood what had to be done. If legitimacy could not be granted, by Rome, then legitimacy must be taken from Italy itself. So he crossed the Alps, leading an army that trudged through snow and stone and silence. Their breath froze in the night, their boots cracked on ice as old roads, carved in Roman times, wound down the mountains. Like pale scars, Italy opened before them, a land of fractured loyalties, of ancient rivalries, of cities that had learned to survive by bending to whichever wind blew strongest. At first, Louis seemed unstoppable. He entered Milan. He moved through Tuscany. He made his way toward Rome, not as a pilgrim, but as a challenger. And Rome felt the tremor. Imagine the city then, narrow streets, stone walls worn from centuries of conflict, torches guttering in the night wind, priests arguing in shadowed cloisters about whether this Bavarian king was the saviour of imperial authority or the destroyer of order itself. Louis marched through those streets with the confidence of one who believed. Destiny walked beside him, and for a moment the city bowed. But Italy is a land with memory. It remembers every conqueror who believed they could tame it, and it remembers every one who failed. Louis crowned a man, not chosen by Rome, declared him pope, and believed he had broken the chains that bound emperors to papal approval. But when a crown is raised against heaven, it casts a long shadow. Allies grew nervous, merchants hesitated, city-states that once had welcomed him began to reconsider. The Lombards watched carefully. The Florentines weighed profit against loyalty, and the Venetians, always listening, always calculating, chose to wait. Italy shifted beneath Louis like restless earth, and in the north, Frederick's supporters were stirring. Austria was not asleep, and neither was the Pope. The Church had been challenged many times before, but rarely with such boldness. Louis's actions were not merely political, they were theological. They touched the very question of who held the authority to shape the world. The papacy refused to bend. It responded with excommunication that spread like a cold wind through the empire, and suddenly Louis's victories felt fragile. His allies grew uneasy, his enemies grew louder. The empire watched, and the empire wondered, what is an emperor without recognition? What is a crown that heaven rejects? What is authority that must shout to be believed? Louis had crossed the Alps with confidence. He returned with questions. His Italian expedition had not broken him, but it had revealed the limits even the strongest men face when they attempt to command forces older and deeper than mere politics. The mountains he had crossed now seemed steeper. The empire he had left behind seemed more fractured. The throne he fought for seemed heavier, and Frederick, the rival he had defeated and then released, was moving again. Habsburg banners rose once more along the Danube. Supporters gathered, old alliances stirred awake, and the imperial conflict shifted northward into lands where the forests kept secrets and loyalty was a currency spent carefully. Louis returned to a realm that was no longer firm beneath his feet. He sensed that something enormous was unfolding. Not a battle, not a single war, but a slow turning of the empire itself. This was not the empire of Charlemagne. This was an empire searching for its identity, its center, its soul. An empire learning that unity cannot be commanded by decree. It must be believed, and belief was slipping, city by city, prince by prince, whisper by whisper. The dual monarchy could not hold. But neither king could step aside, for stepping aside meant oblivion. Louis clung to legitimacy that the church denied. Frederick clung to destiny that the electors disputed. And between them stood millions who wanted only one thing: a world with one emperor, not two; one sun, not two; one sky that did not crack under the weight of divided crowns. And though no one could see it yet, the struggle between Louis and Frederick was laying the first stones of a road that the empire would walk for centuries, a road where power was always divided, where emperors were always questioned, where unity was always fragile, where the church and the crown danced in endless tension, where the empire would survive, not through strength, but through endurance, a strange endurance, a stubborn endurance, the endurance of an idea too vast to be destroyed by any one man, any one pope, any one war. This was the legacy Louis and Frederick left behind, an empire that lived, not because it was stable, but because it refused to die. For a long time, Italy had been a dream, whispered by emperors and feared by popes, a land of marble memories, ancient roads, and cities that still carried the scent of empire in their stones. Louis of Bavaria entered that land with a purpose sharper than any sword, not conquest, not plunder, legitimacy. He wanted the one thing the Pope would never give him: a crown recognized by heaven as well as earth. And so he marched through Lombardy, through valleys that echoed with old victories, past towns that had once bowed to Caesar's eagles. At first, Italy opened like a door unlatched. Cities greeted him with cautious hope. Merchants offered grain and shelter. Scholars whispered that perhaps, finally, a strong emperor had returned to bind the fractured world back together. But Italy is a land of mirrors. Every welcome comes with a warning. Every promise hides a price. The deeper Louis moved, the more he felt the invisible hands of old alliances pulling at his cloak. Guelph and Ghibelline, papal cities and imperial cities, families whose hatred lasted longer than any dynasty. Italy did not need an emperor, it needed a referee for its endless storms. Louis walked straight into them. Still, nothing stopped him. Not the shifting loyalties, not the whispers of Rome, not the warnings carried by envoys who dared not speak too loudly in the emperor's presence. His eyes remained fixed on the ancient city, waiting beyond the hills. Rome, the cradle of empire, the throne that had slept for centuries, the symbol without which no ruler of the West could claim to be more than a restless king. Louis approached as countless conquerors had approached before, with reverence, with ambition, with the weight of history pressing against his chest. And Rome, old Rome, felt him coming. The basilicas stirred with unease. The clergy murmured in corridors. The Pope, now exiled, furious, a shadow behind French walls, declared Louis unfit, unworthy, unwelcome. But Louis had crossed mountains to reach this moment. He had endured wars, betrayals, and the judgment of men who believed they alone held the keys to heaven. He would not turn back. When he entered Rome, the city did not erupt into joy or violence. It simply watched, as it had watched for 1,000 years, another man step into its orbit, hoping he could command it. Louis made his way towards St. Peter's, a basilica that carried more ghosts than pews. He did not kneel as a penitent. He knelt as a challenger, and history once again held its breath. The ceremony that followed was unlike any, since Charlemagne, no pope, no blessing from the seat of Peter, only Roman clergy who dared to defy the papacy and crown an emperor without permission. Louis bowed his head. A crown of ancient authority was lifted, and in that instant the silence thickened like winter fog. A crown lowered, a world shifted, and Rome, for the second time in 8 centuries, saw a man rise as Emperor of the West without its sanction. It was bold, it was dangerous, it was a declaration that the empire had life, not granted by the church, but born from its own memory. For one moment, Louis stood taller than any king in Christendom. But destiny is cruel to those who grasp power without securing the ground beneath their feet. The coronation did not unite Italy, it shattered it further. Some cities celebrated, others recoiled, all waited for the inevitable retaliation from the Pope and his allies. Louis pressed on, establishing administration, creating courts, enacting law, trying to bind Italy to the empire through order instead of fear. But Italy is not a land that accepts order from foreign hands. The deeper he built, the more it slipped through his grasp. Rebellion sparked in the countryside. Papal agents fanned unrest. French influence slid across the peninsula like a storm cloud. Even his own men began to question whether the dream of a restored empire was worth the endless turmoil. Louis felt the weight of every decision press into him like armor he could not remove. In Rome, the antipope he installed held authority only by shadow. His presence angered the church. His existence strained alliances, and his legitimacy was made of smoke and fragile hope. Louis tried to hold the city, tried to anchor his reign in the symbolic heart of empire. But the heart did not beat for him. Italy was turning against him. The Pope had united powerful enemies. The Habsburgs were rising again, and whispers of rebellion drifted across the Alps toward Bavaria. The empire was calling him back. Louis understood what all emperors learn. Sooner or later, Rome gives, Rome tests, Rome devours. And so, with unwilling steps, with heavy breath, he left the eternal city, not defeated, not broken, but burdened by the knowledge that an empire cannot be restored by ceremony alone. He crossed the Alps again, through snow and stone and silence, the same path he had once taken with hope burning in his chest. Now that hope felt thinner, colder, flickering in the wind of gathering opposition. Behind him, Italy exhaled. Ahead of him, the heart of Germany beat with unrest. And Louis, still emperor, still defiant, walked toward a future that no longer bowed before him. The crown he wore was heavier than the one Charlemagne once lifted, because Louis had learned the truth that every emperor of this age would one day face. To wear the imperial crown is to walk between earth and heaven, never fully belonging to either. To rule an empire in the Middle Ages is to stand on a bridge that trembles beneath every step, and to claim Rome without Rome's blessing is to awaken storms that echo across centuries. But storms do not end. When the emperor leaves Rome, sometimes the truest storm is the one that follows him home. Louis descended the Alps, not as a conqueror triumphant, but as a man carrying a crown that weighed more. With every mile behind him, Italy simmered in uneasy silence, a silence that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a blade is drawn. Ahead of him, Germany waited, not with open arms, not with celebration, but with suspicion and shifting loyalties. that curled through the empire, like smoke from an unseen fire. Louis felt it. Before any messenger could speak it aloud, the empire had changed. In his absence, power, real power, does not sleep. When an emperor travels, it moves, it gathers, it chooses, and now it was choosing against him. Frederick's supporters, whom Louis believed he had cowed, were rising again. Princes whispered that Louis had overreached. Cities murmured that the Italian dream was nothing but a costly shadow. Clergy repeated the papal condemnation as though it were scripture carved into stone. Louis had made his stand in Rome, but the empire was not Rome. It was 1,000 small worlds, woven together, and each one was pulling loose. He journeyed northward, along roads where villagers watched in silence. Some bowed, some turned away, most simply stared, trying to understand what kind of emperor returned from Rome without Rome behind him. Louis rode on, through valleys filled with winter fog, across rivers that carried broken ice, like drifting omens, past monasteries where monks lowered their eyes and whispered prayers. He could not hear. The empire was slipping, not collapsing, not rebelling, simply slipping, the kind of subtle shift that emperors fear most, the quiet turning of hearts and minds away from the throne they had once trusted. Louis reached Germany to find that loyalty was no longer where he left it. Princes who once pledged unwavering support now hesitated. Some withdrew their soldiers, others demanded concessions, a few openly questioned whether Louis still held heaven's favour. He did not answer them. He could not. Not in a world where legitimacy hung suspended between earth and sky. For an emperor without papal blessing was an emperor walking barefoot on shards of fate, and fate was growing sharp. Frederick of Austria returned to the stage, not as a rival defeated, but as a rival reborn. He had survived captivity. He had survived humiliation. He had survived the moment Louis believed the Habsburg claim had been broken forever. Yet here he was, gathering strength, collecting allies, reshaping the political winds, with each careful promise spoken in guarded halls. Louis saw it happening, not in a single moment, not in a single messenger's warning, but in the way the empire breathed. When Frederick's name was spoken, less fear, more hope, not because Frederick was beloved, but because the empire was tired of division, tired of unrest, tired of popes and emperors using crowns as weapons against one another, tired of the sky being torn in two. Louis returned to Bavaria to reorganize, to gather strength, to prepare for the inevitable storm. But storms cannot be prepared for when they grow from the very ground beneath one's feet. Rebellion sparked, not in grand cities, but in border towns. Whispers grew louder in princely courts. Merchants refused to fund campaigns. Scholars who once praised him now wrote cautiously, choosing words as though they might be judged in some divine court for daring to support a condemned emperor. Louis tightened his hold. Frederick strengthened his claim, and the empire, fragile, exhausted, stretched between two visions, watched. As the conflict deepened, the Pope was not silent. Rome's condemnation echoed across Christendom, declaring Louis an intruder in the sacred line of emperors. Declarations became threats. Threats became alliances. Alliances became armies. Louis realized that he had not merely defied the papacy, he had awakened it, and once awakened, Rome rarely returned to sleep. The Church pressed Frederick's cause. The French crown moved in shadow. Italian factions shifted once more. Even within Louis's own lands, the ground trembled with uncertainty. Nothing collapses faster than the confidence of those who once believed. Louis tried to command the winds. He issued decrees. He rode from duchy to duchy. He spoke of unity, of order, of imperial dignity that must be defended. But dignity cannot hold an empire together, not when the Pope declares the emperor unworthy, not when princes smell weakness, not when rivals rise from ashes. You believed, you had stamped out. Louis still held the crown, but crowns are not anchors. They are mirrors, reflecting the world's belief back at the one who wears them. And the reflection was dimming. Frederick's influence grew stronger. Habsburg banners reappeared in territories Louis had once claimed. Conflicts erupted across the empire, short, sharp, like sparks, igniting dry branches. Louis responded, as any emperor would, with force, with decree, with urgency. But urgency can crack what it tries to save, and slowly, quietly, fatally, the empire began to tilt, not toward Frederick, out of love, not toward Louis, out of loyalty, but toward the possibility of survival. Survival in those years meant choosing stability over vision, habit over courage, old dynasties over bold defiance. And so the ground moved, not in a single battle, not in a single decree, but in a long, slow drift that even Louis could not stop. The emperor who crossed the Alps to claim Rome now faced the truth that all medieval rulers learn too late. Power is not held by the strongest hand, but by the hand others choose to believe in. And belief, once shaken, rarely returns. Louis looked across his empire and saw not revolt, not ruin, but something worse. Indifference, princes turning away, cities waiting, a world that no longer breathed with him, but around him. He had tried to rebuild Rome. He had tried to anchor the West to an imperial dream, older than memory. Instead, he found himself standing on the edge of an empire that was learning, slowly and painfully, to live without trusting, who sat upon its throne. For a long time after Louis left Italy, the empire felt unmoored, as if the Alps had not only separated nations, but split time itself, leaving one world behind and forcing another to begin. Louis crossed back into Germany, with dust on his cloak, silence in his retinue, and a crown that no longer glimmered the way it once did beneath Rome's trembling candlelight. He expected the empire to greet him as a returning emperor. Instead, it greeted him, to one, as a question. Princes bowed, but their eyes flickered sideways. Bishops spoke soft courtesies, but their words felt thin, coated with careful distance. Cities kept their gates open, not for loyalty, but for caution. Louis had gone to Italy, seeking legitimacy. He returned, carrying doubt, and doubt is heavier than any crown. He soon learned that Frederick of Austria, his old rival, his shadow in battle and in destiny, had been released, not by mercy, not by surrender, but through a negotiation woven quietly between powerful hands, far from Louis's reach. Frederick walked free from his mountain captivity, a changed man, not bitter, not broken, tempered, the kind of hardness that only comes from surviving the edge of political extinction. The empire murmured his name with renewed curiosity, because a man who endures humiliation without collapsing acquires something stronger than prestige, mystique. Frederick returned to Austria, beneath banners once lowered in defeat. His people welcomed him with cautious joy, and the world felt the balance begin to shift. Louis sensed it immediately. not through spies, not through counsel, but through the quiet way the empire breathed again, as though Frederick's return had restored a shape it had been missing. Soon the two men stood before one another, not on a battlefield, but across negotiating tables, heavy with parchment and the dust of centuries. And in 1330, something unprecedented happened. Two emperors chose to share a throne. The Treaty of Haguenau was born not from unity, but from exhaustion, from an empire too tired to keep bleeding for the pride of two men, from princes who wanted stability more than victory, from churchmen who feared that if the empire tore further, nothing would remain to mend. The treaty was delicate, strange, a construction held together by compromise instead of conviction. Louis kept the imperial title. Frederick became king of the Romans. Together, in theory, they would rule. Two crowns, one empire, one uneasy balance. It had never been done before. It would never work again. But for a brief moment, the empire exhaled. Louis tried to believe that this was a victory, that by allowing Frederick to rise, he could rise with him. Two rulers, holding the empire steady between them. But power, shared, is power, thinned, and soon the cracks appeared. Courts argued over whose seal should finalize decrees. Princes petitioned both men and obeyed the one they preferred. Judges issued rulings. In competing codes, taxes flowed down uncertain channels. Cities grew confused over which banners to fly. Merchants began to choose their loyalties based on profit, not law. The empire became a body with two beating hearts, neither strong enough to sustain it. Louis saw the confusion multiplying like smoke. Frederick felt the strain of ruling a realm that did not fully accept him. But the moment that might have changed everything never came, because death came first. In 1330, Frederick of Austria died. Some said illness, some said exhaustion, some whispered that the wounds he carried from years past had finally asked their price. Whatever the truth, his passing fell over the empire. Like a curtain, the second crown fell silent. Louis woke one morning to discover that his rival was gone, his partner, his shadow, his equal, his opposition, and for the first time in 16 years, there was only one man beneath the imperial sun. He should have risen stronger. He should have felt the empire return to him. He should have stood as the unquestioned emperor of all the lands between the Pyrenees and the Baltic. But something had shifted too deeply to be reversed. Frederick's death did not restore unity. It revealed how little unity remained. Princes no longer needed him. Cities no longer believed in the promise of imperial order. Clergy looked to Rome for legitimacy, not to the emperor. Louis carried the crown in name, but the empire was slipping beyond his grasp. He tried to tighten his hold. He issued laws with iron language and sharp urgency. He reclaimed lands that had drifted during the years of dispute. He pressed nobles to reaffirm their loyalty. But the harder he pulled, the faster they drifted. The empire of Charlemagne had once been a river flowing from a single mountain. Now it was 1,000 streams, each running toward different horizons. Louis saw it, felt it, lived it. He had wrestled with Rome. He had marched across Italy. He had crowned emperors and defied popes. He had shared a throne and outlived a rival. But none of it anchored the empire the way he hoped, because an empire is not a crown. It is not a coronation. It is not a decree. It is not even a victory. An empire is belief, and belief was fading. Louis ruled, but the empire no longer followed. He walked through halls of stone that once shook with the pride of Charlemagne and felt them echo with absence. He sat upon a throne that once commanded kings and felt instead the coldness of a seat no longer feared. His crown still shone, but its light did not reach as far as it once did, and the empire, still vast, still ancient, still dreaming of unity, began drifting toward a new future, one Louis would not live to shape. For a long time after Frederick's death, the empire drifted, as though a great hand had wiped the map, but forgotten to draw it anew. Louis stood alone, but solitude did not give him strength. It hollowed him. He had spent years fighting a rival, measuring his steps against another man's shadow. Now the shadow was gone, and nothing rose. To replace it, only a vast, echoing emptiness, where authority should have lived. The empire had learned to survive, without choosing a side. Now it learned to survive, without choosing an emperor. Louis felt it everywhere, in the brittle silence that followed his decrees, in the hesitant bows of princes who did not meet his gaze, in the quiet rebellion of cities that obeyed only when it suited them, in the letters he received from clergy that grew shorter, cooler, more careful. With every passing month, even the land seemed to shift beneath his feet, because power does not disappear. It migrates, and now it was migrating away from the throne. The first signs were small, a prince choosing to negotiate taxes with local towns. Instead of the crown, a bishop settling disputes without requesting imperial approval, a city minting coins that bore no imperial symbol. Little things, tiny fractures. But fractures, if ignored, become fault lines. By the time Louis noticed, the empire was cracking across regions, subtle, silent, relentless, and in those cracks, something new began to grow. Cities, not the Rome Louis had tried to claim, nor the Aachen, where Charlemagne once shaped the world, but the rising towns of Swabia, Franconia, the Rhineland, living, breathing worlds of merchants, craftsmen, guilds, and ambition. These cities had grown wealthy during the long years of imperial conflict, trading across borders, while princes argued and emperors disputed which name belonged on the crown. Now they realized a truth as sharp as any blade. A distant emperor could not protect them, but each other, together, they could. And so, quietly at first, then boldly, they formed leagues, Swabian towns, sent envois to one another. Citizens gathered in candle-lit halls to draft oaths of mutual defense. Merchants pledged support. Guilds provided armed militias. Judges unified their laws. The empire was still an empire in name, but the cities were becoming their own world. Louis saw it happening, saw banners of city leagues fluttering where imperial banners once flew, saw markets prosper without imperial oversight, saw feuds resolved without imperial courts. Every time a city settled its own disputes or built its own alliances, the empire shrank, not in land, but in spirit, and spirit is what makes empires endure. Louis tried to call the cities back. He summoned councils. He issued decrees. He reminded them of their oaths to the crown. But an oath is only as strong as the belief that sustains it, and belief was the one treasure Louis had lost. The princes watched the cities rise and wondered if, perhaps, this was the future, a world not of empires, but of territories, each ruling itself. The Pope, still nursing fury from Louis's defiance, saw weakness and pressed harder. Rome issued warnings threats, proclamations that chipped slowly at what remained of imperial prestige. Louis responded with defiance, with sharp words, with letters written like swords. But swords cannot cut what cannot be touched, and the Pope was far beyond his reach. Years passed, not swiftly, but with the slow grind of weight pressing down upon an emperor who could no longer lift it. Louis aged, not in body alone, but in the heaviness behind his eyes, in the way he rode, a little slower, a little quieter, in the way he listened to counsellors, speaking of problems he could no longer solve. He had once believed that the throne was a mountain, solid, unchanging, eternal. Now he realized it was sand, shifting beneath his feet, slipping, no matter how tightly. He tried to hold it. He saw princes rule as kings, in all but name. He saw prelates shape faith without imperial guidance. He saw cities that no longer waited for permission. And perhaps the cruelest truth, he saw that the empire continued to function even when he did not act. That is the moment an emperor truly falls. Not when he is defeated, not when he is deposed, but when he discovers the world moves on without him. Louis walked through the halls of Munich and felt the whisper of endings. The throne that once felt cold beneath him now felt distant, as though it belonged to someone he no longer recognized. He remembered Italy, Rome, the basilica, the crown lowered onto his head with the weight of centuries. He remembered believing he could restore what had been lost, and he remembered the silence that followed, not the holy silence of reverence, but the hollow silence of doubt. In his later years, Louis became aquieta figure, not diminished, in the eyes of all, for some still saw him as the rightful emperor, but dimmed, as though the flame that once burned in him now flickered against winds he could not command, and the empire, still vast, still wandering, still searching for its shape, drifted into a world where its strength no longer depended on one man. Louis had tried to hold the empire together through will, through courage, through defiance, through ceremony, through law. But empires cannot be held by force of personality alone. They are not crowns, they are constellations, and constellations require stars that agree to shine together. Louis was only one star, and the others had begun to drift. His reign ended, not with rebellion, not with triumph, but with the quiet, inevitable fading of authority that could no longer command belief. When he died, the empire did not collapse. It simply kept drifting toward new crowns, new dynasties, new storms, and new emperors who would rise, believing, as Louis once did, that the past could be rebuilt. But the past does not return. It echoes, and Louis of Bavaria became one such echo, a reminder that even an emperor can reach for Rome, touch its ancient crown, feel its weight, and still watch the empire slip away. For a long time, the empire had measured its strength by emperors, by princes, by crowns and seals, and battles fought in snow and dust. But after Louis faded, from the centre of the world, a greater power began to rise, a power not born in palaces or forged on battlefields, but shaped in markets, in workshops, in narrow city streets that glowed with lamplight long after royal courts fell silent. It began in Swabia, not with armies, but with merchants, not with decrees, but with agreements whispered across wooden tables in crowded guild halls. Cities that had once bowed to princes and bishops now looked to one another. Instead, they saw what Louis could not revive. That unity was no longer written in the language of empire. It was written in the language of trade, of cooperation, of shared roads and shared dangers. And so, slowly, carefully, deliberately, the cities joined hands. Ulm, Augsburg, Reutlingen, Esslingen, dozens more, each aflame, in a growing constellation of urban might. Together, they became the Swabian League, a brotherhood of walls and markets and free citizens who governed themselves with a confidence that would have shocked their ancestors. Their oath was simple. If one city is threatened, all are threatened. If one city calls for help, none may refuse. It was an empire within an empire, but built from the bottom up, and the empire felt it. Princes watched uneasily as the cities strengthened their militias, built stone gates, and trained men, not for conquest, but for protection. Bishops frowned as urban courts began issuing judgments more trusted than ecclesiastical decrees. Merchants smiled, for the roads were safer, the markets fuller, the caravans wealthier. Power was shifting, not in a roar, not in a revolution, but in the quiet, steady movement of people who had learned to rely on themselves. For centuries, the empire's blood had flowed from emperors. Now, it flowed from cities. Louis, in his final years, felt this transformation, like a distant tremor, a sound he could hear but not silence. But after his death, the tremor became a drumbeat. The empire no longer looked upward for leadership. It looked outward, to networks of towns, to leagues and alliances, bound not by royal ambition, but by shared necessity. And within these leagues, a new kind of citizen was born, a citizen who did not fear the emperor's riders or the bishop's decree, because his city held its own courts, its own militias, its own identity. This was freedom, not declared by parchment, but lived in stone and street. Cities built walls, not only to keep enemies out, but to protect the fragile miracle unfolding within. Guilds formed councils. Councils built schools. Schools taught boys, who would become lawyers, architects, clerks, philosophers, men whose power came not from birth, but from skill. In taverns, travellers spoke of a new political world taking shape beneath the old one, a world where merchants held more influence than minor nobles, where contracts could outweigh crowns, where alliances were negotiated not by bloodlines, but by profit and protection. The empire's shape was changing, and the emperor, whoever he was, could no longer force that shape back into the mould of Charlemagne. The Swabian League was only the beginning. Soon, other regions followed: the Rhineland, Franconia, Hanseatic ports further north, cities that once lived in the shadow of princes now stood beside them as equals, sometimes opponents, sometimes partners, always independent. And with that independence came confidence, confidence to defy unfair tolls, to resist foreign armies, to negotiate directly with kings and popes and merchants from across the continent. A new kind of diplomacy was taking root, one that did not flow through the imperial palace, but through council chambers above bustling markets. The medieval world had begun to reorder itself, and the emperor's voice was no longer the loudest. Some emperors, after Louis, tried to reclaim the old authority. They issued decrees banning city leagues, forbidding alliances, ordering compliance. But commands carry no weight when the world has already moved on. Cities ignored them. Princes negotiated around them. Merchants simply shrugged and continued trading across borders that emperors could no longer control. And in monasteries, where chroniclers scratched history into parchment, one truth became clear: the empire had not died. It had dispersed into cities, into leagues, into networks of people who shaped their own fates. It no longer lived in the crown or the throne or the imperial seal. It lived in connections. The medieval empire had become a woven tapestry, loose, uneven, frayed in places, brilliant in others. A tapestry that emperors could influence, but never again command. And in this shifting world, a strange equilibrium took hold. Princes ruled their lands. Cities ruled themselves. The emperor ruled the idea of the empire, not its reality. An idea can endure, even when its body, Mightiest, fades, and so the empire endured, not as Charlemagne's dream, not as Louis's ambition, but as something softer, larger, more diffuse, a world held together, not by force, but by habit, tradition, and the quiet understanding that even broken systems provide a kind of order. This was the age of the cities, the age when the empire shifted its weight from horseback to marketplace, from banners to guild seals, from swords to contracts, an age that would shape everything that followed. For a long time, historians would look back on this age and wonder how an empire ruled by emperors became an empire ruled by nobody at all, and yet somehow everybody. But if they had stood on the stone bridges of Ulm at dusk, or walked through merchant districts in Cologne, when the river fog drifted over crates of Baltic timber, or listened to the clang of forges in Nuremberg, where guildmasters trained apprentices by firelight, they would have understood. The empire was not collapsing. It was rearranging itself, not dying, shifting away from marble thrones and toward wooden counting tables, toward ledgers, inked with careful hands, toward contracts, sealed in wax, instead of blood, shifting toward the cities. For in those centuries, cities were not merely places, they were experiments, worlds folded within walls, laboratories where trade became law, where cooperation became survival, where identity became something chosen, not inherited. The Swabian League had shown what was possible, unity built from shared need, shared danger, shared profit. But farther north, something even larger was growing, a network of trading cities, stretching along the cold waters from Lübeck to Hamburg, from Visby to Riga, from Bruges to Danzig, a web of ports and markets, woven across the Hanseatic Sea, the Hanseatic League, where the Swabian League was a shield, the Hansa was a tide that carried furs, from the forests of Novgorod, amber from the Baltic shores, wax from Prussian hives, timber from Scandinavian mountains, hops from northern farms, and ideas that moved faster than any caravan and struck deeper than any sword. These cities had no emperor. They did not need one. Their power was born of ships, of sailors who knew the moods of the sea better than the moods of kings, of merchants who could calculate profit faster than princes could raise armies. And as their wealth grew, their confidence grew, and as their confidence grew, the empire tilted. Princes found themselves negotiating with mayors rather than commanding them. Bishops found their spiritual authority overshadowed by economic leverage. Knights found their swords less important than trade privileges. The medieval world was being rewritten in ledger lines and merchant codes. Even in the south, Italian city-states, from Milan to Venice, watched the rise of their northern counterparts with a mixture of admiration and envy. Venice ruled the Adriatic with ships that moved like shadows across moonlit water. Milan built its wealth on crafts that travelled the continent. Florence taught Europe the alchemy by which money became power, and the empire, the great old wandering empire, found itself surrounded by cities that understood power in ways emperors no longer did. Power was not inherited. It was generated, circulated, exchanged. Every marketplace was a council chamber. Every guild hall was a fortress. Every merchant fleet was an army that fought without spilling blood. And this new world spoke a different language, not command, agreement, not decree, negotiation, not hierarchy, balance. In this world, an emperor's word was only one voice, among many, and often not the loudest. Princes had once defined the political landscape. Now they became one element in a polyphonic world of competing interests. The cities, the leagues, the guilds, the merchants, the bishops, the nobles, the imperial court, the papal court, and the shifting alliances between all of them. The empire transformed from a vertical tower into a sprawling web, a web, strong in some places, fragile in others, but impossible for any one ruler to command. This was the paradox of the age. The empire weakened, yet endured. It fragmented, yet persisted. It lost unity, yet gained longevity. For structures that cannot be broken, cannot be mended, but structures that bend can outlast storms, and the empire was bending. Far from the imperial throne in city alleys, where bakers kneaded dough before dawn in harbour taverns, where sailors traded stories for ale in guild chambers, where craftsmen argued over wages and rights, something remarkable was happening. People who once lived at the mercy of nobles were shaping the rhythms of their own lives. Not democracy, not in the modern sense, but choice, agency, collective decision in place of hereditary command. And this subtle shift would shape Europe for centuries. The Swabian League protected the heartland. The Hanseatic League commanded the seas. Countless lesser leagues wove themselves between mountains and valleys like threads binding a tapestry that emperors could no longer control. When emperors attempted to forbid these leagues, the cities merely ignored the commands, or negotiated around them, or delayed their compliance until it no longer mattered. The empire had once been a river flowing downhill from the emperor's will. Now it was a delta, 1,000 small streams, each running toward its own horizon. And yet, it was still the empire, still a shared world of roads and customs and memory, still a civilization shaped by the ghost of Rome and the dream of Charlemagne, still a place where people believed, even without unity, in a broader belonging that stretched beyond any one city or prince. This was the strange brilliance of the medieval empire. It held together not because it was strong, but because it was useful, not because it was unified, but because it was flexible, not because people obeyed, but because they understood that living beneath a loose, distant, imperfect empire was still better than living without connection at all. And so, in this age of cities and leagues, the empire learned not to command, but to accommodate, not to stand above, but to stand among, not to wield power, but to absorb the shifting tides of those who did. And Quietly, almost imperceptibly, the center of gravity in the empire slipped away from emperors and settled into the hands of citizens, whose names will never be recorded. Merchants, craftsmen, clerks, captains, carters, women who ran shops near city gates, boys who learned arithmetic in guild schools. The empire lived through them, and in their hands it became something no emperor could ever fully shape. A world woven instead of ruled. For a long time, the empire had wandered like a great beast, searching for a place to rest. It drifted from throne to throne, from prince to prince, from crisis to crisis, a giant without a steady heartbeat. But then, unexpectedly, almost gently, a different kind of ruler stepped onto the stage. Charles, a man not carved from iron, like the emperors before him, but from study, from listening, from the deep quiet that scholars carry in their bones. He was raised in the courts of France, educated by kings, shaped by theologians and poets, and the subtle art of building worlds with words instead of swords. Where Louis had marched into Rome, like a storm, Charles approached the empire, like dawn, slow, soft, steady, patient. He understood something few emperors before him had grasped, that the empire could not be commanded back into unity. It had to be persuaded, guided, given form that matched the shape it already carried. And so, instead of forcing the empire to return to old models, Charles built a new one. He moved his court to Prague, a city of spires and stone bridges, of scholars and mystics, of alchemists and astronomers who studied the heavens as if searching for the lost blueprint of creation. Prague, under Charles, became something the empire had not seen in generations, a center, a heart, a place where ideas could gather and take root. Universities rose, bridges stretched across the Vltava like stone prayers. Architects carved visions into cathedrals whose windows glowed with colours found nowhere else in the world. And slowly, almost miraculously, to the empire calmed. But Charles was not content with peace. Peace, he knew, was only a breath. It needed structure to endure. And so, in 1356, he inscribed his vision into the bones of the empire. The Golden Bull, a book of laws, a mirror of the age, a document that would shape centuries, not with the force of an army, but with the quiet finality of ink drying on parchment. The Golden Bull did not rebuild the empire as it once was. It accepted the truth, embraced it, refined it. The empire was no longer a single organism. It was a constellation, a spread of independent states, bound loosely by tradition, memory, and the lingering dream of Rome. Charles did not fight this. He formalized it. He declared that the empire would never again be held together by one power. Instead, it would be held together by seven prince-electors, 7 pillars on which the empire would rest, 7 voices who would choose each new emperor not through chaos, not through rivalry, but through agreement shaped by law. 3 ecclesiastical electors, 4 secular electors, each one a guardian of their own lands, their own traditions, their own ambitions. Charles did not pretend they would always agree. He simply ensured that their disagreement would no longer tear the empire apart. It was a brilliant compromise, an act of realism wrapped in golden seals. The Golden Bull took the empire's greatest weakness, its fragmentation, and made it a strength, a system, a framework that allowed the empire to endure, precisely because it did not demand unity it could not sustain. The document named the electors. As the empire's spine, it secured their territories. It prohibited outside interference. It gave them rights, once reserved for emperors alone. Some called it the end of imperial authority. Others called it the salvation of the empire. Both were right, for when power is shared, it loses its brilliance, but gains longevity. Charles understood this. He knew that the empire was too vast and too old to be ruled from a single throne. It needed many thrones, many centres, many voices, and so he wove a structure that allowed emperors to rise, without war, to rule, without extinguishing the freedoms of the lands beneath them. The Golden Bull was less a command and more a map of an empire that was no longer vertical but horizontal, a landscape of princes, cities, bishoprics, and free duchies, held together not by force but by rhythm, a rhythm Charles could hear when no one else could. Under his reign, the empire breathed again, not with the thunder of armies, but with the pulse of stability. Schools flourished, trade deepened, cities grew, diplomacy became an art instead of a battlefield. For the first time in generations, the empire felt predictable, understandable, livable, and in that calm, the memory of Rome dimmed, not forgotten, never forgotten, but softened as though the empire finally accepted that it no longer lived in the shadow of Caesar, but in the glow of its own changing light. Charles reigned with wisdom, with restraint, with a kind of gentleness that emperors rarely possessed. He did not try to restore the past. He shaped the present, and in doing so, he ensured the future. For even after he died, the Golden Bull remained, a lantern hung in the corridors of history, guiding each new emperor through the labyrinth of the empire's politics. It did not simplify. It harmonized. It did not command. It choreographed, and the empire, for a time, learned to dance. For a long time, after the Golden Bull was sealed and carried through the empire, like a sacred lantern, the world watched Charles with a kind of quiet awe, not because he ruled with overwhelming force or because his armies made the earth tremble, but because he did something far rarer in the long, turbulent life of the empire. He offered it rest. The empire, that ancient constellation of dukes and bishops, of river towns and mountain strongholds, had spent centuries surviving storms, storms of ambition, storms of pride, storms born from popes and princes grasping at the same crown. But Charles brought the stillness of a man who understood that true power is not always taken. Sometimes it is placed in the right hands. And so, while the Golden Bull reshaped the legal skeleton of the empire, Charles began to reshape its soul. He travelled not as a conqueror, but as a weaver, stitching connections between lands that had forgotten they once belonged to the same great tapestry. In the courts of Mainz, he listened to the grievances of merchants who struggled against unfair tolls. In the bishoprics along the Rhine, he met with prelates whose authority had once clashed with imperial power, yet who now found in Charles a partner rather than a rival. In Bohemia, his adopted kingdom, he fashioned new laws that protected peasants, strengthened cities, and stabilized the fragile lines between noble and commoner. Everywhere he walked, he made small repairs that, over time, became the hidden foundation of the empire's quiet resurgence. And through it all, Prague grew. Under Charles, Prague became not just a capital, but a symbol, a place where the future seemed to glow, a little brighter. The university he founded was the first of its kind in the empire, a sanctuary for minds that would one day shape both faith and politics. Its halls filled with students from across Europe, Germans, Czechs, Poles, Italians, each drawn by the promise of learning in a city that felt alive with possibility. In Prague's narrow streets, voice mingled in a dozen languages. Scribes carried sheets of parchment lit by winter sun. Philosophers debated beneath arches of stone. The cathedral rose in slow, deliberate breaths, each new spire a testimony to a ruler who believed that beauty was a kind of governance. And yet, Charles was not blind to the empire's fractures. He knew that what he created was not unity, but equilibrium, a balance as delicate as frost on a winter branch. He knew that the electors now held as much power as the emperor himself, that the golden bull, though brilliant, had forever limited the empire's ability to act with a single voice. But he also knew that this limitation was the price of survival. Heavy crowns had broken emperors for centuries. He would not be one of them, so he ruled, not with force, but with presence. Where Louis had fought endless battles to command loyalty, Charles cultivated it in letters, in laws, in long conversations held beside crackling hearths or beneath high-vaulted ceilings, where echoes lingered. Like careful thought, he was a builder, not just of cities, but of relationships. And the empire, for perhaps the first time in generations, felt guided instead of dragged. But history is a restless creature. Even in moments of peace, the seeds of future unrest prepare themselves quietly, patiently. In Charles's final years, those seeds began to stir. Some nobles resented the strength of the electors. Others feared that Prague's rising influence would eclipse the old German centres of power. Still others felt unease at an emperor who ruled without drawing a sword, as if peace was somehow a stranger in the empire's long memory. Whispers drifted through taverns and courts. Had the emperor grown too gentle, too scholarly, too fond of Bohemia, and too distant from the German principalities that once anchored imperial power? Charles heard these murmurs. He did not deny them. Instead, he answered with more construction, more laws, more effort, to leave behind a framework strong enough to endure whatever storm might come next. He strengthened the rights of cities, for he believed the future belonged to those who built, traded, and studied rather than those who only inherited. He reinforced the structure of the electors, for he knew that the empire needed predictability more than it needed heroic chaos. He expanded Prague, turning it into a jewel that even Rome whispered about, but he also prepared his son, Wenceslaus, for the crown, prepared him in the only way a scholar emperor could, with books, with counsel, with long hours, speaking of duty and the delicate balance of a realm that could so easily fracture again. Whether Wenceslaus listened is another story. Charles, in his final days, stood at the window of his palace, overlooking the Vltava, watching the river carry ripples into the distance. Perhaps he understood what all wise rulers learn, that no emperor can hold back time, that every generation must fight its own battles, that even the strongest vision must one day be placed in hands that may not fully understand it. When he died in 1378, bells rang across Bohemia, across Germany, across every land touched by his reign. The empire mourned, not for a warrior, and not for a conqueror, but for something rarer, a caretaker, a stabilizer, a man who treated power as a responsibility rather than a weapon. And the golden bull, his greatest legacy, remained. It remained when the electors quarrelled. It remained when emperors rose and fell like seasons. It remained through wars, reformations, and the shifting tides of a world that would soon leave the medieval age behind. It remained because Charles had written it, not for his time, but for all the times yet to come. He did not rebuild Rome. He did not restore unity. He did not resurrect the old empire. Instead, he created a new one, quiet, enduring, flexible, imperfect, but alive. An empire that could bend without breaking. An empire that learned to breathe instead of burn. An empire that would continue its long wandering story into the next age. A story you and I will keep walking into together as we move to the next chapter of this unfolding epic. For a long time after Charles closed his eyes, for the final time, the empire drifted as though the steady hand that once guided it had released the reins too soon. Prague dimmed. The roads grew restless again. Whispers returned to the corridors of bishops and the chambers of princes. Whispers of opportunity, of ambition, of fractures, waiting to be widened. Because when a gentle emperor dies, the world he held together with patience and law begins to remember its older habits, and the empire's older habit was conflict. Wenceslaus, the son who inherited Charles's dream, did not inherit his discipline, nor his foresight, nor his quiet gravity that had kept storms at bay. He inherited the crown, and little else. From the beginning, he walked beneath a shadow that grew longer with each passing year, the shadow of a father who had bound an empire with nothing more than wisdom and a steady voice. Wenceslaus tried, and in trying, he revealed the truth that haunts many sons. Of great men, a crown can be worn, but greatness cannot be inherited. While he hesitated, others moved. Princes, who had once bowed to Charles, began to test the limits of imperial authority. Some pushed gently, some pushed harder, some pushed with the full weight of their rivalries, and beyond the borders, a deeper rumble grew, a kind of spiritual quake that began in Prague itself. Jan Hus, before his name, became a spark that lit entire kingdoms. On fire, it was only a voice, soft at first, quiet, careful, a whisper rising from university halls, a voice that asked, why should faith be sold? Why should truth to be bound by corruption? Why should the church own the keys to heaven when heaven belonged to all? These words, simple and sharp, slipped like candlelight through cracks in the old world. Students heard, merchants heard, nobles heard, and in taverns, where mugs clinked against wooden tables, these ideas began to glow. At first, Wenceslaus ignored them. He had other crises. Princes who challenged him, electors who grew dissatisfied, councils who whispered that perhaps the emperor was no emperor at all. But ideas do not wait for kings to notice them. They grow, and when the Pope declared Hus a heretic, that quiet glow burst into open flame. Prague rose. Bohemia rumbled. Voices filled the streets, desperate, angry, hungry for reform, and unafraid to strike at the church that had long stood as an unmovable pillar. For the first time in centuries, the empire trembled, not because of princes or armies, but because of belief. And belief, once awakened, does not retreat, not willingly. The Hussite wars ripped across Bohemia like storms made of iron. Cities fortified their gates, Villages armed their farmers, priests fled, princes panicked, and the empire looked toward its emperor, in desperate expectation. But Wenceslaus could not answer, not clearly, not decisively, not like his father once had. He watched as the land he ruled fractured, not along borders, but along faith. When he died in 1419, the city bells did not mourn him the way they mourned Charles. They rang like warnings, hollow, urgent, echoing across streets that had forgotten peace, and the empire entered an age it was not prepared for. Sigismund, Wenceslaus's brother, Charles's other son, took the throne in a world already ablaze. He was older, wiser in some ways, harder in others, a man forged not by calm, but by crisis. But Sigismund made a choice that would haunt him until the end of his days. He lured Jan Hus to the Council of Constance with a promise of safe passage, then allowed him to burn. Across Bohemia, the flames that consumed Hus ignited something far greater than any executioner imagined. A nation rose in fury, a movement that refused to bow to Rome or to the emperor who betrayed their preacher. It was not merely a rebellion. It was not merely a war. It was a declaration that faith could no longer be commanded, that authority could no longer be assumed, that the empire was no longer the empire Charles had nurtured. Sigismund fought them. He raised armies. He called for crusades. He poured gold, soldiers, and years into a conflict that would reshape his life and the empire itself. But the Hussites did not fight like ordinary rebels. They fought like a people who believed they were carrying the future on their backs. They built war wagons that rolled across fields like moving fortresses. They sang hymns that drowned the fear in their bones. They marched with a unity the empire itself had not seen in generations. Battle after battle, crusade after crusade, the emperor's armies broke against these farmers and craftsmen and preachers who held their ground with the ferocity of those who have nothing left to lose. Years passed, wars burned, the land bled, and through it all, one truth crept like winter frost through the empire's veins, that the old world, the world of unquestioned crowns and unquestioned popes, was dying, not suddenly, not loudly, quietly, inevitably, like a long night, ending, even as the stars fight to stay. Sigismund eventually won his final victories, but they were victories, heavy with ash. He inherited Bohemia, not united, but exhausted, not pacified, but scarred. And as he sat on a throne that had once belonged to his father, perhaps he understood what Charles had understood long ago, that an empire cannot survive without vision. And the empire now wandered in search of one. For a long time, after Sigismund claimed the throne, the empire walked as though its feet no longer remembered the shape of solid ground. Every step forward felt like slipping backward. Every decree felt like a whisper against a storm. Every attempt at order was swallowed by the echo of conflict that refused to die, because war, once awakened, lingers long after the swords fall silent, and Bohemia was still burning, not with fire that had cooled, not with rebellion that had dulled, but with wounds so deep they changed the way the land breathed. Sigismund rode through Prague under banners that once glowed with imperial promise. Now they hung like uneasy truce flags flapping in winds that remembered too much blood. He toured the cities. He listened to the bishops. He consulted councils that had fractured into a dozen rival factions. Everywhere he went, voices overlapped, like clashing bells. Some demanded vengeance, some demanded peace, some demanded independence, not from emperor or pope, but from the very world that had forgotten how to protect them. And beneath it all, beneath the councils and the sermons and the negotiations that stretched into exhaustion, the people murmured one soft, devastating truth. They no longer trusted the empire to guide them. This was the wound, deeper than battlefields, deeper than broken walls, deeper than burned villages. This was the wound that reshapes nations, a loss of faith, not in God, but in order. The Hussite wars had cracked something in the empire's spine, and now, as Sigismund tried to straighten it, he felt the bone shift beneath his grasp. Councils challenged him, princes ignored him, cities negotiated as though they were states. Fully sovereign and whole, the empire was becoming a mosaic, beautiful in its diversity, shattered in its unity. And Sigismund, who had once believed that victory would give him peace, now saw how hollow that victory truly was. The more he tried to tighten his grip, the more sharply the pieces cut his hands. In the markets of Nuremberg, merchants spoke openly about governing themselves. In the halls of Mainz, archbishops quietly prepared to guard their rights against imperial intrusion. On the frontiers, noble families built alliances so strong they could resist any emperor who threatened their autonomy. The empire was no longer a tree, with branches reaching out from a single trunk. It was a forest, vast, unpredictable, alive with its own logic. Sigismund understood that he could not uproot it. He could only walk through it, carefully, hoping that the paths beneath his feet did not give way. But even as he walked, the world beyond the empire began to shift. Hungary called to him. The Ottoman frontier darkened. Threats rose from the edges of Christendom, not whispers, but roars. Sigismund found himself caught between two storms, one within the empire, a storm of reform, resentment, and shattered faith, and one beyond, a storm of invasion, of new armies, of a force that would reshape Europe itself. He tried to face both, to be emperor and king and warrior and diplomat. But a man cannot walk two roads at once. The more he focused on Bohemia, the more Hungary suffered. The more he defended Hungary, the more the empire slipped from his fingers. The old chroniclers write of this era as though the empire were slowly falling apart. But that is not quite true. It was not falling, it was transforming. And transformation is always violent. For those who live through it, after years of fighting and pleading and negotiating, after years of watching the empire drift further from the world his father had built, Sigismund grew tired, the kind of tired that sinks into bone, the kind of tired that no sleep can cure. He died in 1437, leaving no sons, no clear path, no lasting unity. The throne fell empty in a world where crowns had begun to matter less and less. But the empire, as always, did not die. It drifted toward a new dynasty, a new age, a new uncertainty. The electors gathered again, their voices heavy with the weight of a fractured world. They did not look for a conqueror. They did not look for a visionary. They did not even look for someone who could restore what had been lost. They looked for survival. And they chose Albert of Austria, a Habsburg, a choice that would reshape the next 5 centuries of European history. But when Albert died, within 2 years, the electors turned to Frederick III, another Habsburg, quiet, bookish, more at ease with parchment than battlefield, a man who would reign longer than any emperor, before or after him, and yet his long reign was not filled with splendour. It was filled with waiting. Frederick the T waited for territories to fall to him, waited for alliances to turn in his favour, waited for opportunities to bloom without his interference. His motto was as patient as he was. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And slowly, painfully slowly, the empire reshaped itself under his stillness, but beneath the stillness, beneath the marriages and negotiations and quiet manoeuvres, another storm brewed, a storm that would not come from princes or foreign armies or even papal decrees, a storm that would come from within the faith itself. For the seeds planted by Jan Hus did not die when he burned. They smouldered in sermons, in books, in restless minds, in the hearts of people who longed for a church that did not command but listened. And as the 15th century drew to a close, those embers would glow again. Soon, a monk in Wittenberg would hammer questions into a wooden door and shake the empire like no emperor ever could. But that is a story for another night. Here, in this moment, we remain with Sigismund, a man who tried to hold a world already dissolving in his hands, a man who learned too late that an empire is not saved by crowns or crusades or armies, but by vision, and the empire, now wandering through the shadows of the 15th century, had none, only echoes of what it once was, and faint whispers of what it would one day become. For a long time, after the Hussite fires dimmed and the Habsburgs settled, into the emperor's throne, the Holy Roman Empire lived in a strange half-life, not rising, not falling, simply enduring, like an old cathedral with cracked pillars and fading frescoes still standing, only because its stones remembered how princes ruled their lands as miniature kings. Cities governed themselves as though the empire were a distant rumour. Churchmen fought their quiet wars of doctrine and power, and the emperor, whoever he was, sat at the centre of a world that no longer turned around him. The golden bull had stabilized the empire, but stability is not strength, and strength, once lost, is not easily reclaimed. Frederick the Thutton waited his way through decades, patient as a rock beside a slow river. His son, Maximilian, inherited a realm that needed more than patience. Maximilian dreamed not of what the empire was, but of what it could be. He modernized armies. He reformed courts. He built alliances with a craftsman's precision. He fought and negotiated and schemed and imagined a world where the empire might stand tall again. But even his brilliance could not halt the shifting tides of Europe. For a new world was rising, a world of gunpowder, printing presses, oceans crossed by ships that carried entire nations into unknown horizons, a world where ideas travelled faster than armies, and when Martin Luther hammered his theses onto a church door in 1517, the echo shook the empire more violently than any battlefield. Reformation spread like a wildfire lit in dry grass. Prince picked sides. Cities embraced new faiths. The church split. The empire fractured, not along borders, but along belief. Peace came and went in uneasy cycles. Treaties soothed wounds, only to reopen them. Armies marched. Villages burned. The 30 Years' War turned Germany into a graveyard of shattered fields and hollowed towns. By the time the Peace of Westphalia softened the final blows, in 1648, the empire was still alive. Astonishingly, but no longer whole. It had become a constellation of almost sovereign states, loosely connected, loosely obedient, loosely loyal, a body whose limbs no longer answered to the same brain. And yet, still it endured, because habit is stronger than structure, and memory is stronger than law. For generations, emperors continued their ceremonial ascents, crowns still gleamed, diets still gathered, envoys still bowed to the idea of the empire. But beneath the ceremony, the truth deepened. The Holy Roman Empire had become a ghost, wearing its own skin. Then, as if the world had not fractured enough, a storm rose from the west. The French Revolution stripped kings from their thrones as easily as leaves fall from winter trees, and out of its chaos stepped a man whose ambition burned hotter than any empire formed before him. Napoleon. He did not see the Holy Roman Empire as a union of history and tradition. He saw it as an obstacle, an ancient structure blocking the path of his ascendant world. And when Napoleon looked at obstacles, he did not negotiate. He rearranged. French armies pushed east like flame across old parchment. Battles shattered what unity remained. Princes defected. Cities shifted allegiance to save themselves. The empire that had once stood firm against Magyars, against Ottomans, against centuries-long storms, now trembled before a single man who carried the future in his stride. Napoleon redrew borders with unnatural ease. He dissolved old states. He created new ones. He elevated allies. He crushed opponents. He carved the map of Germany as though it were clay, waiting for his hands. And piece by piece, the empire eroded. But the final blow was not a battle, not an invasion, not a treaty. It was a choice. In 1806, Napoleon formed the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of German states under French protection. Its members withdrew from the Holy Roman Empire, and the foundation that had held for centuries simply vanished. Emperor Francis II, the last emperor, looked upon the remains of what had once been the beating heart of Europe. He saw that no crown could hold together what the world itself had decided to release. And so, on a quiet August day, he laid the crown down. He dissolved the empire with a declaration that felt less like an ending and more like a sigh, the final breath of a 1,000-year story. No armies marched, no cities rioted, no bells tolled. The empire did not end in fire, it ended in understanding. For a long time, the Holy Roman Empire had survived. On memory, on habit, on the idea that unity was worth the struggle. But ideas are mortal when the world that nurtured them moves on, and Europe had moved on. States rose with iron armies and centralized law. Nations took form where once there had been only territories. Borders hardened. Monarchies evolved. People shifted from belonging to princes to belonging to nations. The medieval dream could no longer stand in a modern world, and so it passed. Quietly, softly, with dignity, like an old cathedral whose doors finally close. Not because it has fallen, but because its worshippers have begun to pray elsewhere. Yet even in death, the empire's shadow stretched on. Its cities remained. Its legal traditions endured. Its universities flourished. Its memory shaped the rise of Germany itself. For an empire does not truly disappear. It becomes a foundation beneath the feet of those who build after it. And so now, as you rest beneath the hush of night, know this: the story of the Holy Roman Empire is not merely the story of emperors. It is the story of a world endlessly trying to hold itself together. The story of crowns lifted and set down again, of faiths clashing and reconciling, of cities rising and kingdoms falling, of dreams built on ruins and ruins that seed new dreams. A story of 1,000 years, ending not in defeat, but in transformation. And when you are ready, we can walk further into the world that rose from its ashes, into nations newly born, into revolutions, into unifications, into the long echo of a history that shaped Europe in ways the old emperors could never have imagined. Just say the word. For a long time, after Francis II set down the crown, Europe felt strangely quiet, as though a voice that had murmured beneath history for 1,000 years had finally fallen silent. And yet, in that silence, something else began to stir, not the echo of empire, not the shadow of crowns, but the faint hum of a new world, awakening. In the markets of Vienna, merchants spoke of change, as though it were a guest, waiting politely at the door. In the courts of Prussia, generals sharpened their discipline into something cold and precise. In the universities of Göttingen, philosophers sketched the early shapes of nations not yet born. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a restlessness in the earth, a sense that Europe had stepped onto a road from which there was no return, because once the empire dissolved, its pieces did not crumble. They wandered, and wandering pieces always search for new forms. The German lands, those ancient territories that had once bowed beneath Charlemagne's banner, did not scatter into emptiness. They drifted towards something larger, something more defined, something the old emperors could never have imagined. A nation, but such a thing does not form overnight. It takes generations, wars, treaties, shifting loyalties, and the slow weaving of identity from the threads the empire left behind. For decades after Etusinde or 1806, Europe trembled beneath Napoleon's stride. He reorganized kingdoms as though adjusting chess pieces, moved borders with the flick of a pen, and shattered dynasties that had stood since the age of armoured knights. But even he, the man who once held the continent's fate in the palm of his hand, could not erase what the empire had ceded. When Napoleon fell and the Congress of Vienna attempted to stitch Europe back together, they did not resurrect the Holy Roman Empire. They created a loser union, a German confederation, a gathering of states that shared language and custom, but not yet a single soul. It was a beginning, a quiet one, a fragile one, but beginnings do not need strength, they need time. Through the 19th century, Germany's map shifted again and again. Trade-bound cities, more tightly than crowns, railways carved lines across the land, like veins carrying new life. Writers and thinkers whispered of unity in poems and in arguments and in dreams. And always, beneath politics, beneath economics, beneath diplomacy, the memory of the empire lingered, not as a blueprint, but as a feeling, the feeling that these lands had once belonged to something larger, something shared, something worth building toward. Again, by the time Prussia rose, under iron leadership, blood-grey uniforms, marching boots, cold ambition, set like steel, the idea of a German nation was no longer a whisper, it was a storm. And in 1871, when the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the world saw a strange echo of the past, a new empire wearing the clothes of a modern age. But this empire was not the Holy Roman Empire. It was sharper, more decisive, less forgiving, built not on faith, but on industry, not on tradition, but on power. And yet, even in this new age, the old empire's shadow stretched across the map, in legal codes, in the structure of its states, in the rhythm of its politics, in the very idea that unity could be layered, complex, more a symphony than a single melody. That was the true legacy of the Holy Roman Empire, the understanding that Europe is not a single story, but a tapestry, woven not from dominance, but from coexistence, not from uniformity, but from difference, not from conquest, but from the slow, careful balancing of countless identities, even today, as nations carve their futures. With new tools and new visions, the skeleton of the old empire lies beneath them. The federalism of modern Germany, the idea of shared sovereignty, the concept that states can be many, yet function as one, these are not inventions of the modern world. They are echoes of the empire that lived for a millennium in the heart of Europe. And so, as you rest here in the quiet, after this long journey, remember this: the Holy Roman Empire did not fall, it transformed, it dissolved, so that Europe could reshape itself into new forms. It stepped aside, so that nations could take its place. It ended, not in collapse, but in evolution. Its memory is not a relic, but a foundation, a deep, ancient layer beneath the structures of the modern world. A reminder that power is fragile, that unity is complicated, that identity is never a single thread, but 1,000 fibers intertwined. A reminder that history does not move in straight lines. It circles, it spirals, it folds back on itself in patterns we sometimes understand only centuries later. And perhaps, as the night deepens and your breath slows, you can feel what remains of the empire, its faint heartbeat beneath the earth, its quiet lessons woven into Europe's soil, its old dreams still drifting gently through time, dreams of unity, of struggle, of endurance, of a world that kept trying to hold itself together, even as everything kept pulling it apart. Dreams that whisper still in the stones of Prague, the forests of Saxony, the cathedrals of Cologne, the hills of Bavaria. Dreams that belong now, not to emperors, but to all of us who listen. And when you are ready, we can step beyond the empire, into the age of nations, into the rise of Germany, into wars and reunifications, into the vast unfolding story of Europe itself.